Katie, and welcome to another episode of Learning Out Loud, where we explore history's pivotal moments with curiosity and compassion. History's not stuffy. It's a story waiting to be told. And speaking of stories, you know how Texas likes to talk up its independence and its ability to secede whenever it wants? But did you know that California had its moment in the sun? Very briefly, California was declared an independent republic. And that's what we'll be talking about today. We'll talk about how it happened and what it meant for the U.S. in this week's episode. Welcome back to our first series, American Rebellions. This week we'll be talking about the Bear Flag Revolt, which took place in California in the early 1840s. All right, so let's start off with some background. First, I think it's important to get the lay of the land literally. The U.S. went through rapid expansion up until 1840 and didn't show any signs of stopping. The U.S. territory at the time included everything east of the Mississippi River, including Florida, and parts of the Great Plains, and as far west as parts of what are now Wyoming, Montana, and Colorado. Britain controlled most of what is now Canada and had territorial disputes with the U.S. over the Oregon Territory, which includes present-day Oregon, Washington, and Idaho. Mexico owned most of what is now the U.S. Southwest, including California, New Mexico, Nevada, Arizona, and the other parts of Colorado. The Republic of Texas at this time was an independent area, and that could be its own other story. But it does kind of tie into the Bear Flag Revolt, so we'll get into that briefly. So that's what the territory of North America looked like in 1840. So we've got the U.S., Britain, and Mexico at this point. Now you may be wondering what was going on with the Native Americans at this point, and I'm glad you asked. By 1840, we have already seen Andrew Jackson's Indian Removal Act 10 years prior, which has become known as the Trail of Tears, and that is where 40 to 60,000 Native Americans were forcibly removed from their lands and marched to eastern Oklahoma. About 10,000 died either during the march or shortly upon arrival. The Trail of Tears marks one of the last final mass removals of Native Americans by the U.S. government following decades of pushing the natives west and west and west. Violent campaigns to get rid of them, and disease that spread from Europeans that also killed many natives. The removal of Native Americans at this time also spoke of the mindset of what many Americans and the U.S. government thought in terms of what they deemed to be, quote, theirs. The term manifest destiny was coined in 1845 and embodied this belief, and was the idea that the U.S. is destined by God to expand its dominion and spread democracy and capitalism across the entire North American continent. This idea justified the Indian Removal Act and later expansion, and consequently intensified the issue of slavery as the government fought about which new states would be allowed to have it, eventually leading to the Civil War. The U.S. had more than doubled its size with the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, gained more land after winning the War of 1812 against the British, and seized land from the natives after forcing them to leave their lands. And in 1845, Democrat James K. Polk won the presidency largely on a platform of U.S. expansion. President Polk would end up overseeing the largest territorial expansion in American history. Opponents of the Democrats' fervor for expansion were worried about having to fight wars against both Britain and Mexico. Despite their worries, Polk was able to annex Texas within his first year and negotiated the acquisition of the Oregon Territory from Britain without going to war in 1846. But that's just a little preview and a little spoiler alert. But let's get into the Bear Flag Revolt. All right, so now that we have the lay of the land and what the U.S. mindset was like, let's just go over specifically who was living in California and what life was like at the time of the Bear Flag Revolt. First, we'll talk about the natives. The California landscape made native tribes pretty isolated from each other and from the tribes of the Great Plains, and for that matter, European settlers in the east. This isolation also made warfare a bit impractical, so there was relative peace for Native Californians. There were over 135 distinct native dialects, and many tribes who lived in smaller clans or just with large family groups, with neither having much political structure like the Great Plains and East Coast natives. When Europeans first came to California, it's estimated that the native population was around 300,000 people, which accounted for about 13% of the native peoples in all of North America at the time. Between 1840 and 1870, the California native population declined to just 12,000 people due to disease, removal, and basically just flat-out murder. Currently, there are 110 federally recognized native tribes in California, and there's 81 more groups seeking federal recognition. According to a 2010 report, California represents 12% of the total Native American population at 720,000 people. Some of this population is due to the Relocation Act of 1956, which relocated 60 to 70,000 out-of-state Native Americans to the Los Angeles area. But out of the entire California population, Native peoples make up roughly just 1.7% of the population, and that's according to a 2022 census. And then we have the Spanish. Spain first enters the chat in the 1530s when Cortez and his men explore what is now Baja California. In 1542, Juan Rodriguez Cabrillo sails north along Alta California and gets as far as what is now Santa Barbara and claims that whole area for Spain. But Spain doesn't really do anything with this area for another 200 years. So it's not until the mid-1700s that Spain gets serious about colonizing and controlling what we now call California. They did this through setting up presidios, aka military forts, and missions run by Catholic priests. Small towns called pueblos cropped up close to these missions and presidios, and they tried to attract settlers with land grants. A fun fact, California got its name from the Spaniards who had originally called the peninsula on the west coast of Mexico, California, which is now Baja California, because they thought they had actually discovered an island. California was a fictional island paradise from a popular 16th century Spanish romance called Los Serges de Esplandian. But it was not an island, and they called what is present-day California Alta California. And then finally, we have Mexico. Mexico gained its independence from Spain in 1821. One of the first things the new Mexican government did was to, quote, secularize the missions, aka remove the natives and mission property from the control of the missionaries. Most of the missions' lands were redistributed in large grants to white Californians or well-connected immigrants from other parts of Mexico. This time period also saw the rise of the rancheros, who raised cattle for beef and hides, and they became more dependent on foreign trade along the California coast. This time period also saw more British, Canadian, and U.S. settlers moving into the Oregon Territory as trappers and mountain men in search of adventure. As more of these men came into the Oregon area, they began moving south, encroaching upon Mexico's Alta California. Before Mexican independence, there were few permanent residents of non-Hispanic birth or descent, but those numbers steadily increased during the Mexican era. The Mexican government had a hard time governing Alta California. For instance, in 1842, when they sent their last governor from Mexico City, Manuel Michel Torreno, his appearance triggered a local revolt, and he withdrew in 1845. A local ranchero of part African heritage, Pio Pico, became the official Mexican governor after this, and with this, California was kind of left to its own devices. In reality, power was held by wealthy local families called Californinos, who were California-born but of Spanish heritage and considered themselves separate from Mexicans. By the time of the Bear Flag Revolt, California was home to a native population now less than 100,000 and some 14,000 other permanent residents. Of these, roughly 800 were what we would say are foreigners, which were whites of non-Hispanic descent. Also to note, the Oregon Trail was just starting up around this time in 1840, and for the next 20 years, the route saw somewhere between 300,000 and 400,000 people who ended up settling along the West Coast. Okay, now for real, let's get into the Bear Flag Revolt. Now that we have the layout of the land, who was there, let's get the story of the Bear Flag Revolt. In 1845, there started to be rumors that the Mexican government was going to start making it harder for non-Mexicans to own land in Alta California, and there were also rumors that said the government was going to kick out undocumented American settlers. These rumors, now combined with the newly sworn-in U.S. President Polk's desire to expand the U.S. into the west coast of North America, and Mexico's previous hands-off approach, sets up California to be a prime target for the U.S. President Polk sends a captain of the Army Corps of Topographical Engineers named Charles Fremont on a, quote, scientific expedition to survey the area of the Great Basin and the Great Salt Lake. He also gave Fremont secret instructions to just casually invade Mexican territory if war should break out, but who knows? There's no definitive proof of this last part, but many historians believe Fremont was told essentially to start the war himself by riling up U.S. settlers within the Mexican territory. Whether he was given explicit instructions or not, Fremont's expedition does enter Mexican territory in Alta California in December of 1845 and raises an American flag at Galvin's Peak, which is now, ironically, called Fremont Peak near Salinas, California. This almost led to a skirmish with local Mexican authorities, but Fremont and his men were able to escape to the Oregon Territory. Fremont's expedition also carried out at least 2 massacres of indigenous peoples during this time, most notably what became known as the Sacramento River Massacre, where they indiscriminately killed several hundred Wintu people. Around the same time, in December of 1845, President Polk annexes the Republic of Texas, which pisses off the Mexican government, and they sit stewing over this for the next several months. But back to Fremont, he isn't quite done with California yet. He does come back in late May and meets a group of undocumented U.S. immigrants in the Sonoma Valley in early June. These men had already ignored a Mexican order to leave, so Fremont felt like he had found his people to start his rebellion. They steal some horses and head off to the city of Sonoma. Other accounts I read state that Fremont and his men are a bit hands-off at this point and let the U.S. settlers lead the charge. So these men are led by a dude named William B. Ide, and they come across the home of retired Mexican Colonel Mariano Vallejo, and they ask him to surrender to them. Vallejo, a Californio, seemed to be agreeable to having the U.S. take over. He shared this viewpoint with other Californios who felt like Mexico had abandoned them and wouldn't protect them, and they were actually more fearful of a Russian invasion than a U.S. one. Others, however, were vehemently against American annexation and wanted nothing to do with help overthrowing their own government. Here's how I described being a U.S. settler in the Mexican territory, and the he in this quote is the American settler. Quote, he also solemnly declares his object to be, first to defend himself and companions in arms, who were invited to this country by a promise of lands on which to settle themselves and families, who were also promised a Republican government, when having arrived in California were denied the privilege of buying or renting lands of their friends, who instead of being allowed to participate in or being protected by a Republican government, were oppressed by a military despotism with extermination if they should not depart out of the country, leaving all of their property, arms, and beasts of burden, and thus deprived of the means of flight or defense. We were to be driven through deserts inhabited by hostile Indians to certain destruction. End quote. Oopsies. That's kind of awkward. Imagine that, huh? Isn't it ironic? Okay, first off, none of that was true. No one had promised them any land or change of government, and the undocumented U.S. settlers were actually forgiven Again, imagine that. For coming into the country illegally and were given until the spring to obtain their residence permits before they'd get kicked out. But sure, keep playing the victim card. You go for it. But anyway, with Vallejo's surrender, the group essentially take over the city of Sonoma and declare California an independent republic. They create a new flag for their new republic. They draw a grizzly bear, a lone red star in reference to the Texas Republic Lone Star flag, and write the words California Republic with a red stripe across the bottom. The grizzly bear was because the group of men were hunters and adventurers and referred to themselves as osos, which is Spanish for bear. And again, ironic they're using Spanish, right? But it is also argued that they use the grizzly bear as a form of intimidation. The California grizzly bears fed on California's cattle, which is how they made their living. There wasn't much to be done. Bear hunting expeditions did not stop the growing population of grizzlies, and the U.S. rebels knew this, and so using the grizzly bear as their symbol, and could also refer to themselves as bears, was to intimidate the locals. And this flag was adopted by California as the official state flag in 1911. My favorite part of the flag creation story is that the local Mexicans kept telling them that the bear looked more like a pig than a bear. And also another little fun fact about how everything is connected. The guy that they put in charge of the flag making process was a guy named William L. Todd, who happened to be a cousin of Mary Todd, the wife of future President Abraham Lincoln. So at this point, we've got Fremont and his men, and they join up with the other Osos, and they have some skirmishes with Mexican forces, and they end up taking over the areas which are now San Francisco and get more U.S. settlers to join the cause. And then we have another U.S. military dude entering the picture in July, a man named Commodore John Sloat. He was the commander of the U.S. Navy's Pacific Fleet. He had also been given instruction to attack Mexico if war broke out, but he also got a bit of a head start and made his move before getting official word to do so. He captured Monterey on July 7th and declares California for the U.S. Fremont learns about this a few days later and takes down the Bear Flag and hoists up the U.S. flag. The California Republic only lasted about 3 weeks. Ironically, the U.S. had actually declared war on Mexico at the end of April in 1846 after Mexican troops attacked U.S. troops in a disputed area of Texas. However, even this action seems purposeful because Polk specifically sent these troops to that area, most likely trying to get a response out of the Mexican military, which would give the U.S. cause to declare war. Interestingly, though, it appears the news never reached Fremont or Sloat, and they were seemingly acting independent of the U.S. government's declaration of war, which is pretty crazy. We won't get too much into the actual Mexican-American War, but the U.S. won pretty easily on the battlefield, despite being outnumbered by the Mexican army. And we also see some future popular Civil War military leaders getting their first military experience, like Ulysses S. Grant, Robert E. Lee, and Winfield Scott, and then also future President Zachary Taylor. The war ends in 1848 with the U.S. triumphing over Mexico and with the signing of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. The U.S. agrees to pay $15 million and assume all of the Mexican debts to Americans in exchange for the areas of New Mexico and California. So this territory includes present-day California, Nevada, Utah, and parts of Arizona, New Mexico, Oklahoma, Colorado, and Wyoming. Mexico also agreed to finally relinquish all of Texas, including the disputed area along the border. An interesting tidbit, and kind of sucks for Mexico, gold was first discovered in California just days before Mexico signed the treaty ending the war, and this discovery would completely change California in so many ways. The treaty between the U.S. and Mexicans allowed Mexicans living in the now U.S. territories to become U.S. citizens and allowed them to keep their land and property. Despite what this treaty said, by the end of the 1800s, many Mexican Americans had been stripped of their land, faced racial discrimination, low wages, and lynchings. And that is something that is not often talked about in American history, is the racial discrimination that Mexican Americans faced, and let's be frank, still face today. Most people know or have at least heard of the Jim Crow South, but Mexican Americans were treated similarly by white people in the Southwest, and that time period and laws were referred to as the Juan Crow era. I was born and raised in Southern California, and I don't remember ever learning about any of that in my history classes. I only got a brief overview of it when I did a summer leadership class, and Sylvia Mendez came to speak to us about the topic. She, as a little girl, was rejected from a public school in Orange County because it was whites only. So her family sued, and the case Mendez versus Westminster was decided that forced segregation of Mexican American students was unconstitutional. However, it didn't allow for African American integration, as Mexican Americans were deemed, quote, white. But many of the arguments made in this case would end up being used in Brown versus Board of Education, which didn't occur for another 8 years. That is the case which would rule that racial segregation in public schools was unconstitutional, period. Another interesting fun fact is that Thurgood Marshall, the U.S.'s first African-American Supreme Court justice, was actually the lawyer for both the Mendez and Brown cases. But anyway, that's just a little tangent, and we can dive deeper into all that later. But as for the Native Americans, the treaty did not give them citizenship or any rights or protections. U.S. settlers in the new U.S. territories continued to indiscriminately murder the indigenous peoples, picking up where Fremont left off and massacring them in the hundreds at a time. Sickeningly, the first American governor of California, Peter Burnett, said, quote, that a war of extermination will continue to be waged between the races until the Indian race becomes extinct must be expected. While we cannot anticipate this result, but with painful regret, the inevitable destiny of the race is beyond the power or wisdom of man to avert. End quote. I highly recommend reading the PBS SoCal article titled Untold History, The Survival of California's Indians, written by Chris Clark for more details. We'll eventually cover it in our future episodes, but if you want to read more about how the California Native people survived such horrific treatment, check out that article. I like how the article starts off with how the centuries of California Native people's history is taught in 4th grade, if you live in California, which I can attest to. And here's how Clark put it, quote, California was originally populated by people who did not farm but made very nice baskets. The Spanish Padres arrived and the California Indians moved to the missions to learn to farm. Some of them died there, mainly because their immune systems weren't sophisticated enough to handle modern diseases. By the time Americans arrived, Native Californians had mainly vanished somehow. The gold rush happened, and California became a modern society with factories and lending institutions, end quote. And it's true, the indigenous peoples really just do disappear from history books, and they're thought of in the past tense. But surprise, Native peoples still exist today. And like I've said about African American history in our last episode, Native American history is, everyone say it with me, American history. And they deserve to have their stories told. And that's something that I want to do with this podcast. Tell stories of often overlooked American people. And although the U.S. won the Mexican-American War, the conflict over what to do with the vast amounts of territory sparked further controversy in the U.S. The question over whether slavery would spread to these new territories would drive the North and South even further apart. To conclude this episode, I wanted to take some time to talk about what some contemporary people thought about the war shortly after the treaty signed, and how this was a significant event in U.S. history that ended up leading to the Civil War. First, I have a quote from Ralph Waldo Emerson, and he prophetically wrote, quote, "Mexico will poison us," end quote. And Captain Ulysses S. Grant later in his life argued that the Civil War was God's punishment for the Mexican-American War. He claimed that it was a wicked war that was rooted in imperialism and the expansion of slavery. But many Americans supported the Mexican-American War at the time, and they viewed it, again, like we were talking about earlier, as the fulfillment of Manifest Destiny. While Manifest Destiny remained a core of the U.S. national identity, in the 1840s it encouraged a slew of ideological debates over this potential new territory. Specifically, the territory should be free or enslaved. And I just want to read you the whole quote by Grant because I think it's very important and very powerful. He said this in an 1879 interview, quote, "With a soldier, the flag is paramount. I know the struggle with my conscience during the Mexican War. I have never altogether forgiven myself for going into that. I had very strong opinions on the subject. I do not think that there was ever a more wicked war than that waged by the United States on Mexico. I thought so at the time, when I was a youngster, only I had not the moral courage enough to resign. I had taken an oath to serve 8 years, unless sooner discharged, and I considered my supreme duty was to my flag. I had a horror of the Mexican War, and I have always believed that it was on our part most unjust. The wickedness was not in the way our soldiers conducted it, but in the conduct of our government in declaring war. The troops behaved well in Mexico, and the government acted handsomely about the peace. We had no claim on Mexico. Texas had no claim beyond the Nueces River, and yet we pushed on to the Rio Grande and crossed it. I am always ashamed of my country when I think of that invasion," end quote. I think this is really interesting that he admits to all this. At the time, he had already been president, and he was speaking to a reporter. And you just don't really hear someone of such power speaking about mistakes, especially about war and invading a country. So I just thought that was really interesting, that he had such a strong opinion about it. But regardless of how he felt, the end of the Mexican-American War leads to one of the biggest things to happen after, which is the Compromise of 1850. Now, this allows California to be admitted into the Union as a free state, but Utah and New Mexico territories were allowed to decide on slavery through popular vote. Remember that the previous Missouri Compromise stated that any state or territory north of the 36th parallel would be free, but this would essentially split California into two, so they needed to come up with a new compromise. The Compromise of 1850 also included a very strict Fugitive Slave Act, which required the return of escaped slaves, even if they were in a free state, and anyone who obstructed the capture of a slave would be fined $1,000, which is about $40,000 today, and up to 6 months in prison. Although the Bear Flag Revolt and the California Republic did not last very long, its intentions, along with those of the Mexican-American War, had long-lasting impact on the U.S., as well as on the Native Americans and Mexicans living in the newly acquired lands. I wanted to end with this quote from battlefields.org. Quote, "To say Mexico poisoned the United States is an understatement. The bloodshed during the Civil War rivaled any other American conflict, and today we are still in the process of healing wounds that occurred over 150 years ago." End quote. Thank you for listening to this week's episode. If you want to go into more depth about any of the things that we discussed today, make sure to check out the episode's show notes, where I will have all of the sources that I used for my research linked there. And be sure to tune in next week, where we continue the American Rebellion series around the time that this episode leaves off. I'll see you then. Bye. If you have a topic idea you'd like for me to cover, or just have any comments, feel free to reach out via email at learningoutloudpod@gmail.com, or on Instagram at learningoutloudpod. If you like the show, don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe on your favorite podcast platform. Thanks.